Thank you for coming. And first, I want to start off to just have a question. If people would raise their hand if they've ever collected remotely from any synchrotron beamline.
1986.
And second question is, how many routinely collect remotely now? And that's why we're all lonely at the beamline. My first disclaimer for this talk is that, as you can see, you have many people who are routinely collecting data remotely. And so I do not consider myself an expert in remote data collection. If you want to talk to an expert, look around at your colleagues that have much more experience. Because if I need to use the beamline, I can just walk out my office and go and use it that way. And even when we're testing, we have a very limited set of conditions we're testing under. So that's my first caveat. Just my outlining a talk. First, I'm going to give an overview of remote data collection, and apparently that's already wrong since Jim's collected back in '86. Then I'll briefly describe AnyCat remote. This isn't meant to be an instructional tutorial of how to use the remote system, but just give you an idea of how our system functions and maybe some differences with other systems. And then finally, get a little bit into how to get the most out of remote data collection. So, surprisingly, there's no textbook that describes the history of remote data collection, so it took me a little bit of time to try and scrounge around to find out information about sort of the history of remote. The driving force behind most beamlines going to offering remote seems to be this PIs would like to save time and, most importantly, money from having to eliminate the need to send their grad students out on airplanes to the synchrotron. One of the advantages that this creates, though, is that you have increased flexibility in the scheduling of synchrotron time. And some beamlines do a better job of this than others. I was talking with someone yesterday who was talking about he usually goes to SSRL, and whenever they need beam time, they just have to be put in a queue, and usually within a week they're ready to get on there and take data. And so that has the advantage of flexibility on your end, because it only takes you a few days to prepare samples, ship them out. You don't have to worry about reserving airline tickets or any of that stuff. But it also gives the beamlines flexibility when they have a hole of time that's not being used. They can kind of quickly fill it with someone who's already ready to use that time. And so that allows us to be much more efficient in the use of synchrotrons. So in my search of history, it seemed that CIRCAT and SSRL were the two groups that were the first to offer remote data collection users on a relatively routine basis. And that seemed to be around 2005. And now currently in 2014, I have 40 MX beamlines. That's actually an undercount. There's more than 40 MX beamlines that offer remote data collection, and that's spread out over 10 different synchrotrons around the world. And so you can see there's a rapid growth of implementing this remote data collection for the advantages that it offers. So what about remote AnyCat? We're relative newcomers to remote data collection. We first got remote data collection running for users on 24IDE in the second run cycle of 2012, so just about 2 years ago. And then 24IDC, we began offering it at the end of last year. But what you can see from the next slides is this is the total, basically we counted the number of sessions, data collection sessions that we had. And we split it up in pink as remote data collections and blue as local data collections. And you can see almost immediately after offering, we were already a quarter of our users chose to use remote rather than local. And now we're routinely running 2/3 to 3/4 of our users are running remotely on 24IDE. And in the case of 24IDC, you can see we had a later start than IDE, but even within the first run cycle that we offered it, we were already around 50% of our users were choosing to run remote on that. So this is just a schematic diagram of AnyCat's remote. It's a bit unusual in that our interface on your end is through a web browser. And so what you see is you just call up a web page that allows you to get into the system. And then there's a lot of stuff on the behind the scenes that allows commands to be transferred from the web page directly to our beamline control system. So basically what you have here is a front end which serves up the web page, records any clicks or for commands, and then passes them to the back end, which then sends those commands to the console, which, as most of you know, is our software at the beamline, and it emulates pressing buttons on the software at the beamline. Console then communicates back to this back end through a Redis database, which basically allows it to send key value pairs that give information about the status of the beamline, which is interpreted by the back end and then fed back to the front end so that you have some idea of what's actually going on at the beamline. And then in addition, the front end, it contains a MySQL database which has information on all the groups and users that are using the system, so to control who has access to the beamline at what time, and a Redis database that communicates with Rapid so you can pass the information back and forth between those two systems. So, why do we choose to go the web interface route? One of the reasons is in order to run this, all you really need is some computer that has a recent version of Firefox, Chrome, or Safari, and a relatively fast internet connection. We're not sure exactly where the minimal is, but we do know that users who try to run it over DSL have had less success than those who have a dedicated cable internet connection. And so you can see there's no need to download any specific software or any fancy connections. You can just, everyone here knows how to use a web page, and so they're very familiar with that interface. The other advantage is that it puts a layer between the buttons that you're pressing and what's actually going on at the beamline. And so we have a little bit of control of what sort of functions you can do on our system, but it also means that we can actually streamline our interface to present you only with the functions that you really need, and you don't have to worry about all the beamline functions that we need for focusing and optimizing the beamline. So basically how remote works for access is that groups are assigned to a certain block of time, and when their block of time is active, any user that's in that group can log in. One person can control, anyone else who logs in can still observe. Basically, they get the same screen, they just can't push any buttons. Anyone not in the group is unable to control or observe during that time, with the exception of beamline staff who always have the option to observe the beamline and can take control of the beamline at any time should they need to fix something or help a user overcome a problem. Remote does include a link for downloading data. Basically, this is a Python script. On the web page, when you log in, you hit a Git sync. It asks you to download the program. You can do that anytime before or after your data run, as long as that your time has been put in. And that sync, when it's running, you can run it in either a reiterative mode. So while you're actually collecting data, it will constantly cycle through and kind of keep the data coming as you're collecting it. Or if you're already collected all your data, you can run it in just one big download and have it come in all at once. And the other point is that groups have access to images from prior sessions, so they can actually go in, log into the remote system, click on a button that says View Images, and it pops up an image viewer, and so you can go back and look at data that you collected previously, as long as the data is still somewhere on our computer system. So that's usually guaranteed for 6 months at least, but in practice, much longer than that. So just a quick view of what the interface looks like. And one note is that in order to run this smoothly, this window here, or this part of the window here, is about 1,200 pixels wide. So if you're trying to run at lower resolution than that, everything gets kind of squished together. It gets a little difficult to run. So I would suggest if you're running, have a minimum of 1200 pixel resolution. Over on the right, there should be 2 camera views. In this case, this one wasn't working at the time, but this one shows a shot from directly above the spindle, looking down at the where the crystal mounts. And this one has a movable webcam that can survey around the IDs, the hutch and the beamline. And these 2 views, if you click here, can actually be slid out the way. So if you have limited screen space, it allows you to kind of make the most of it. What you see over on the left is you have buttons that allow you to change your sample, center it, change the zoom, do a 3-click centering, and then the save and clear are for if you're setting up a vector for vector scanning functions. Image tools would draw a circle or use a ruler so you can measure how big your crystal is, and those kind of functions. Or on the right, you can control the backlights so you can see your image. You can set up snaps or runs, and in runs, I should say that you can have a simple 1-point rotation, or you can set up a continuous vector scan if you've already put in a vector, so that's available. And then you have control over omega. And on 24 IDC, if the mini kappa is installed, you also have control over the kappa and the phi for the mini kappa. Along the bottom, these are informational statistics about the beamline, things like the ring current of the beam, and current wavelength that you're at, what sort of flux you're getting through, and depending on which information they have, for example, the aperture, we can change the aperture size. If that's the case, if you double click on this window here, it will allow you to change the aperture. And similar for other functions such as changing the wavelength on 24 IDC or even accessing the sample mounting. And in this case, since this is an administrative panel, when your staff is logged in on this, we have the ability to take control on the user interface. If they're actually controlling, what they would see is release control, or if they're observing and no one's controlling, I believe they also get the take control button so they can actually take over from someone else. Images are displayed on a separate tab as View Images, and basically what you have here on the left is just a list of all the images that you've collected, both snaps and runs. The runs are set up so that if you click on this sort of name of the run, it actually will collapse that, so you're not having 5,000, a list of 5,000 images kind of clogging that up. Displays the image here, gives you some of the image data such as where the omega was at the start of the oscillation, what your oscillation angle was, exposure, transmission, distance. If rapid is running, it will provide feedback once it gets its results and give you a summary of that here. And then you have controls for zooming in 1, 2, and 3 times. You can put rings, which give you an indication of resolution. And this 1 degree slice in single image is for when you're doing fine slicing with the Pilatus. A lot of times people have trouble if they're looking at 0.2 degree slice, seeing the spots because they're relatively weak. What 1 degree slice would then do is add up images to make 1 degree, so it's a little bit more familiar to what you would be used to looking at 1 degree oscillation. And then something coming online soon is the crystal analysis tab. What this is going to let you do is either do a line or a grid scan across the crystal, so you can assess things such as the homogeneity of the crystal, or you can use the grid scan to find a crystal that's hard to see. Basically on the left is all the things you need to set that up. And what you're seeing here is after it runs, we use a distal server to give us information about the number of spots that are found, and then we'll have a color-coded map of basically what you're seeing here is the green number 4 is indicating that you're getting the most spots from right from that spot. And you can kind of see the outline of the crystals there. Okay. And then the final tab is tools, and basically what that has is it has access to a internet chat function, which you can use to communicate with staff. It has some tools that allow you to reset things at the beamline. So if something freezes up at the beamline, you have a chance to maybe recover without having to wake me up at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it gives error messages are also listed under tools. So what can remote not do? So ideally what we want remote to do is basically anything that you could do while sitting at the beamline, we'd like remote to be able to copy. And basically our current limitations as far as that function are that crystal analysis is not fully implemented yet. Frank is working hard on that and hopes to have it in the coming days, if not today. You can't do fluorescence scanning on 24 IDC. So if you need to do a scan for selenium or something like that, you need to communicate with the beamline staff so that they can coordinate and get that scan done for you. This isn't a problem on 24 IDE because it's obviously a fixed wavelength. So. And then just in general, you're always going to be limited by the automonitor and how many samples it can hold. And previously, and currently still on 24 IDE, our automonitors could only hold 4 pucks at a time, which was not what users liked, especially if they had the overnight shift. They could easily go through 4 pucks before anyone was awake to come back and change pucks out for them. So now we've built this new robot that John had shown earlier, which can now hold 14 pucks, and that's installed on C, and they're currently, as soon as they make sure that this is running smoothly, they'll begin building the one for E, and hopefully we'll have that by the next run. So what's sort of the optimal setup for running remote at NCAT? Well, we envision that remote is run in tandem with rapid. Even though remote gets information, summaries from rapid, the actual rapid interface gives a lot more information. And we also envision that the user will want to be downloading their data at the same time they're collecting data. And what you can do is you can actually set up each of these on a separate computer. For instance, with the data download script, as I mentioned, you can actually get that before you even start collecting data. So say you have the overnight shift, you want to collect data at home. You can actually, before you leave your lab, if you have a place that you're downloading the data to, start that download script up before you start your data collection, have it running. So once you actually do start getting data, it'll constantly update, and hopefully by the time you come in the next day, all your data has been downloaded. This probably should be separated out on a separate computer than where you're actually running remote, because obviously that's going to be a high bandwidth function as far as the internet connection is. Ideally, these two would be running on separate machines just so you don't have any memory issues or internet connection issues by trying to feed all the images here and then also feeding all the information that Rapid relies on. But in practice, you can actually run these on the same machine normally. And it's useful to be able to come back and forth between the two to check on how things are going. But as with anything, if you're actually going to run this, we recommend that you contact us ahead of time and check your setup to see whether it actually works. So now we're switching over to getting the most from data collection. And this slide's a little bit misleading because it's the only one I have for this. First component is you and your samples. It's your time. You need to make the most of it. And I could spend probably 4 hours even giving a most brief introduction to all the things you can think about as far as what you need to control on your end of the experiment or things you need to plan for. In fact, you could probably give an entire lecture series on just what goes into making a good experimental plan. But the idea here is that you need to remember that a lot of effort has gone into providing that beamline to you. So use your knowledge and wisdom to plan well to make the best use of it. Okay? And remember that as far as your system is concerned, you are the expert. We see lots of different systems. I mean, just one example is how many in this room would be really excited to see 5 angstrom data from their crystal system right now, right? And other people are like, 5, I don't want to bother with that, right? But And that's just one example. There's many others. One thing to keep in mind as you're collecting data, your first priority, obviously, is to collect data that leads directly to a useful structure, right? But your second priority is, as you're doing that, and in fact, if you're not able to get that, you're trying to learn as much as possible about your crystals and how they behave, so that in the future you can use that knowledge to make better decisions or plan different strategies to make the most of the beamline. The second thing I've included to make the most from remote data collection is your sample preparation. And this includes things like actually growing the samples, cryo-cooling them. But what I'm going to focus on here is the hardware that goes into mounting the samples and shipping them to the beamline. So the first thing you want to know is what sort of pins are going to be compatible with the beamline that you're going to. And so this is directly from our website. We have a manual for our auto mounters, and all these pins are compatible with the ALS style auto mounters that any cat use. The reason these are in green with the check mark is that if you're on 24 IDC and you're using the mini kappa, you want to stick with these Hampton pins. These all have various issues with the mini kappa. Either they don't mount cleanly some unacceptable percentage of time, or they tend to have a very loose connection to the mini kappa. For example, with these copper pins, it reduces the magnetism of the strength of the magnetic coupling, and so they have a tendency to fall off. So if you're using the mini kappa, stick with these two, but otherwise, any of these types of pins should work. So, that's great if you're ordering a whole bunch of new pins, but what if you have a whole bunch of old pins in your lab that you want to try and use? How are you going to determine whether or not you have one of these acceptable pins? Well, obviously the spine are pretty easy to figure out, but with the other type, what you're looking for is if they have this sort of ledge around on the base, that's bad. If they have this smooth conical edge all the way down and then drop, that's good. Okay. The second thing you want to inspect on your pins and bases is you want to see if it's glued. Okay. Especially if you have older pins, after a while the glue tends to fail after going through a number of freeze-thaw cycles in the liquid nitrogen. And what ends up happening is you get a little bit of liquid nitrogen behind the pin, and as you put that up on the goniometer, that starts boiling off, and your pin just starts pushing right out, and eventually falls off. So make sure your pins are secured with either crazy glue or super glue. This is important. We found this out about probably 2 years ago. We had one group, they kept coming in and their bases were glued in. They knew they had glued them up, but every time they put them on, the pin would start moving around. And what we finally figured out is that they were gluing them up and then within a couple hours mounting their crystals and putting them in liquid nitrogen. And what was happening is that the glue was not curing all the way, and so it was still flexible. And so as you put it up on the goniometer, it would warm up and would expand and make the pin dip and bend. So if you're gluing up new pins, make sure you allow that to cure for at least 24 hours. And then finally, you want not too little, but too much is also bad. So this is an example of a pin. It has a little bit too much. You can see it goes all the way up here. And what happened is it actually came down onto this area. And so when our gripper is sort of a cylinder that comes down and clamps down, so when it tried to come down and clamp, it clamped really well. It didn't want to let go. So you have to be careful with that. And the other thing is that generally, I wrote it down here, they need to be 18 millimeters in length. And then the other thing is you want straight pins. So if your pins are bent either accidentally from how you stored the pins so that they kind of go off like this, or if you have one of the ones that are meant to be bent to reorient the crystal, you have to be careful because if you bend them too far, then they interfere with the gripper being able to come down. So why do we have to be so finicky about whether or not they're secured? Well, this is an example here. This is after it's already mounted. The pin pushed out and it just ends up flipping down and hanging right here on the goniostat. And if you think about it, what happens that goniometer comes back in, this could either stick up here and prevent any, flip up onto the face of the goniometer mount and then prevent other samples from being mounted easily. It could drop into the MD2 and possibly gum up something down there. Or if it hasn't completely come out, sometimes what happens is it sticks into the gripper and jams up the mechanism in the gripper, so the gripper is no longer able to grip samples. And so then you try and go and mount your next sample and you get nothing. But in addition to it falling out after it, these pins are being transported around. You're flipping pucks up and down. They could fall out before you ever get the sample up and see it. And you wouldn't want that. So moving on to the pucks, NCAT uses the ALS style auto mounter, which is compatible with two pucks, the ALS style pucks and the unipucks. And so basically what you have here is a puck base. The pins would go vertically into those depressions, or on here they fit under the bumps. And then this lid slides down over them to protect the samples while they're in transit. So what sort of things do you want to look at when you're preparing your samples before you start using a puck? So these bases are held to the lid by these little clips, and these clips have a tendency to start bending outward. This can cause a couple of problems. The first one, obviously, is if they bend out too much, you lose that clamping, and as you lift up your puck, the base will simply drop off. And if it's loaded up with pins, they're going to scatter all over the place. The second thing is sometimes they'll curl out, and as you put them into the shipping dewar, they're on a sleeve, and they can catch on the edge of the shipping dewar or the sleeve and jam the pucks into the dewar. So you want to make sure that you check these clips. And if you do find that you have clips that are starting to bend or broken off completely even, Crystal Positioning, which sells all of these pucks, I think can also supply you with spare clips that you can easily put back on. There's just a little screw here. Another thing you want to check, especially with the ALS pucks, is you want to look at the magnets that are along the base. So you can see here, they're just simply, it's a flat magnet that's screwed into the puck base. This is a relatively new magnet. There's no cracks in here. This is one that's gone through a couple of freeze-thaw cycles. You can start seeing cracks developing. This one's still good to use. The pieces of the magnet have not completely broken away. They're still held in. And you probably won't have a problem with this. But this one, on the other hand, there seems to be a little bit missing. And you can see here what happened if we flip open the base is that little piece is actually flipped inside onto where you're going to put the sample. So if you tried to put a sample in here, because this is a relatively large piece, that sample would be tilted, and then when you go to put your lid on, if you didn't notice it, you're going to end up losing that sample because you crushed it. But even more insidious is when they're even smaller than this, you can get them where they're small enough that they actually fit quite nicely underneath the base of the sample, which is great, except when you go to pick it up, it likes to stick with the sample and then goes onto the goniometer, which has a magnet. The magnet holds it better than the sample. So now you pull it off, but now you left a little bit of magnet behind, and any sample you now put onto the goniometer is tilted, quite probably outside the code. So you want to be careful of that. And finally, make sure your pins and pucks are dry. This is an extreme case. What you see here is a view down the dewar of one of our auto mounters. This is a nicely settled puck base in there flat. This one had one pin that was actually frozen to the base, so when the gripper went to grab the one pin, it decided to pull up the entire base and hit the lid, jammed the robot. Finally, once we got it to release, the base fell back down, and now it's sitting crooked in the dewar. So that's an extreme example, but even minor examples are that if you have moisture on your bases, one, you can get, that can lead to frosting of your crystal. You get ice buildup on the surface of your crystal. Or you just simply get a little frostiness on the bases you get a layer of frost underneath that base. It's all cold, goes up on your goniometer. You don't know about it. You send up your crystal. Eventually that ice thaws. All of a sudden you go to collect your data and you're not getting any data even though you perfectly centered your crystal because that ice thawed, the base settled, and your crystal is completely shifted out of the beam. So you want to try and minimize any moisture or ice that's on the pins or pucks and try and be aware that as you're working with them to try and minimize any accumulation of moisture. Okay, how about shipping them? So here's an example of a puck sleeve. This is our recommended type of shipping sleeve that you want for your pucks. And the reason for that is it has a nice shelf for each of the 7 pucks that it can hold. So even if I'm only shipping 1 puck, I don't have to worry about it slamming around during shipment. Right. One thing you do have to remember is to worry about the orientation. So if you can see here, there's this little protrusion on this end. That should be at the bottom of the sleeve when you go to ship. If you don't, you're only going to get 6 pucks into that sleeve. And then also you want to make sure that you place this retaining pin into this puck shipping sleeve. That makes sure that the pucks don't slip out during the shipping. And if they slip out, that's a problem when you go to try and lift the pucks out of the dewar. They're going to catch on the edge of the dewar, and it takes quite some effort to get them to settle back in. There's also another version of this puck sleeve. Basically, it uses the hole in the puck, and you basically stack them up. We don't recommend this for a couple reasons. One is that a lot of people forget to use these styrofoam things. I don't know if they don't know what they're for, or if they just don't want to bother with it. But basically what these are is, if I have 1 puck here, I can put the styrofoam on top of it, and then with this retaining clip, it fills up that entire cavity of the dewar. And so once you put the lid for the dewar in, that puck's not going to be able to slide up and down on the pin. And so you have 1 for each of those spacers, depending on if you have 1 or up to 6 pucks. And obviously 7, the sleeve would be full, and you don't need a spacer. But the other thing that happens is that very often this connection here is just a plastic connection. You're pushing metal into a plastic sleeve, pushing metal into a plastic sleeve. That has a tendency to fail. You can imagine, you have 7 pucks on here. That's kind of heavy for such a small component. And so what ends up happening is that this little hook pulls off, and now it becomes much harder to get your pucks out. And then the other component of shipping your samples is the actual dewar. So before you begin to store your pucks in your dewar, you want to make sure that it will stay cold. And it's quite obvious to us when it gets to arise at the beam line when that's not the case, because we go to fill it up with liquid nitrogen and it's just boiling, and so the entire case on the outside gets frosty. So if you see that sort of behavior after you fill your dewar, so usually what I would do if I'm filling a dewar that's been dry for a while and is warmed up, it's going to give the same effect because you're putting cold nitrogen into a warm environment. But once it settles down, if I top it off with liquid nitrogen, leave it overnight, and I come back, I should see that level of liquid nitrogen hasn't dropped very much. So that's a way to check that. And usually what this is caused by is a failure of the vacuum for the dewar. And there's ways of correcting that. And if anyone does have a dewar that failed in that way, you can talk to us and we can maybe help you fix that dewar to make use of it at a later date. Of course, you probably won't trust it as well as you did before. But clearly label your dewar. We have 2 beam lines. We're running pretty much any time APS is running, so at a minimum, especially if we're shipping so that dewars arrive a day early, we have at least 4 dewars that we have to figure out where your samples are. And that gets even tighter on weekends or when we have large groups like Harvard where they're sending maybe 12 dewars for 2 days. These dewars stack up into our receiving area, and so it's much easier to find your dewar if you clearly labeled it on the outside so that we can easily find your dewar when we go to load your pucks in. You want to ship to arrive at least 1 day early and track the shipment. Okay, the 1 day early is so that if when you track your shipment, it doesn't actually get there, you have a chance to recover that dewar before your time starts. Okay, and don't ship on the weekend. APS doesn't deliver dewars to the beamline on the weekends. So if you're planning on collecting on the weekend or even Monday morning, ship it so that it arrives on Thursday. That way we'll top it off. We'll keep it cold while waiting for you to collect data, but you'll at least know it's arrived and is ready for you to go when you get there. And the third thing I'm going to talk about for getting the most out of data collection is the beamline staff. And you've got to remember, it's our time too. We can easily give this to any number of people. So in order to get the most out of data collection, you want to interact with the beamline. You got 3 keys: communicate, communicate, communicate. Okay. So communicate. First of all, before you come, usually a week before you come, whoever is assigned to your support for your day will have contacted, at the minimum, the on-site spokesperson. So if you haven't heard who's doing support for you a week ahead of time, talk to whoever's on the ASAP as the on-site spokesperson. You can ask them, or simply email anyone at AnyCat, and they'll usually forward it right to the person who's responsible for that. So what we need to know before the experiment is we need to know who's coming, right? And we need to know that schedule of who's using the beamline when, which pucks are they using, which dewar are those pucks in, all that stuff. And also we would like to know a phone number where we can reach anyone who's using the beamline when they're using the beamline. Certain setups are, you're collecting in the lab, you don't have good cell reception, don't give us your cell phone number. Give us a phone number that's for a landline, so if there's a problem, we can contact you. If you're collecting from home, don't give us the lab number unless you have that forwarded to your cell phone. Or give us your cell phone number so we can contact you. And we will always try to provide you with our cell phone numbers so that you can contact us while you're collecting data if you have any issues. So communicate during and after the experiment about the actual experiment. One thing, we're going to load and unload your pucks, so we need to know which ones those are. We need to know when they need to go in. We need to know if there's any special order you want them in. While you're running, if something breaks, we can usually fix those for you. So you'll want to communicate with us if that's happening. We also want to hear about if you have something that's working, but maybe you can think of a way it should work better, or you don't like the way it works, you think it should work differently. Let us know that. We're the ones who can make changes to the beamline. If there's a function that you think should be added, communicate that to us. And then also back on the broken, like I mentioned, there's that tool tab that allows you to overcome certain failures at the beamline, especially at night. Although we are on call 24 hours during your data collection time, a lot of people, if something happens at 3 a.m. and they're able to reset and continue going, they don't, thankfully, want to bother and wake us up. But it is useful to know that something happened during the night. And the system is set up so that we sometimes get error messages if something fails. But that doesn't really give us all the information. That tells us something failed on our end, but it doesn't give us any information about how you were running the system. Were you trying to BitTorrent while collecting data? That might explain your problem. But it may be something more subtle than that. It may not even be something that's obvious to you. But if we have more information about it, we can start figuring it out, because if we start seeing it a lot under similar conditions, then that can give us a clue. But if you restarted during the night 5 times and never let us know that, or how, what sort of system you were running or what sort of connection you had, that makes it very hard to diagnose what was wrong. And so it's very important that you give us feedback at some point on how your experience went. And usually the best way to do that is to directly communicate with whoever was your support staff. And then the final point about communication is that we can help you become better crystallographers. So at AnyCat, all of our user support staff are trained PhD crystallographers. That's fairly common that I don't think there's a beamline in the world where there's not at least one fully trained crystallographer at the beamline running it. And you have to remember, we're sitting right at the beamline. We're seeing hundreds of crystals and thousands of images a week. We're looking at how they index, what sort of strategy they're giving, how they're integrating. So just by sheer volume, we're going to start picking up on certain things. And the chances are that if you're having a problem, we've seen that problem before with someone else. And hopefully they've communicated that they had a problem. We've been able to either help them or they've figured out with some input from us how to overcome that problem, and we can pass that information along to you. But you have to remember that relies on a communication go on. If you don't tell us you're having a problem, we can't help you. And if you do have a problem and we give you some advice, we really want to know whether or not that advice was effective. Sometimes we, well, you should collect this way, and they go ahead and do it, and they go on and go back home and start processing the data. And we're never sure whether or not our advice was useful or not. So when the beamline staff does take the time to help you out, give them feedback on whether or not that information is helpful. And if you come up with another solution that worked better than what they suggested, give that information as well, because the more information we have, the better we can give information to other people. So, and just pointing out, beamline staff is there to help. We want you to make efficient and effective use of the beamline because that is our resource, and we want to make sure it's getting the best use out of it. But we also want you to be successful. Your success leads to our success. If you guys aren't able to get the structures you want and publish your data, then NIH decides that we're not worth funding. So we definitely have a vested interest in your success. We do want to know if things aren't working the way they should, or even the way you would like it to work. And we need that feedback to improve the user experience and to spur innovation at the beamline. And so I just wrap up with acknowledgments. You've seen the user support staff. I just want to point out those who have worked on remote. Obviously, Malcolm Capel is in charge of console, and he's done a lot of things to modify his program to allow remote to communicate with it. Amit Balani was briefly with us, and he did a lot of the programming for the back end that allows that communication to happen. And Frank Murphy did most of your work on the front end and is now the current support person for AnyCat Remote. So thank you very much.